Welcome, fellow explorers of the shadows, to Beyond Midnight. If you haven't already, take a moment to subscribe and join our growing community as we delve into the darkest corners and most forgotten histories of our past. Tonight, we journey back to a time of mud, superstition, and unimaginable hardship, a time when survival was a daily struggle and dignity often a luxury few could afford. We're talking, of course, about medieval Europe. When we think of the Middle Ages, images often spring to mind: valiant knights in shining armor, grand castles, beautiful princesses, and bustling market towns. But beneath this romanticized veneer lay a brutal reality for the vast majority. Life was short, often painful, and almost always defined by relentless labor. And within this landscape of widespread toil, there existed certain professions that pushed the boundaries of human endurance, jobs so utterly repulsive, so dangerous, so socially reviled, that they stand out as truly the worst imaginable. Tonight, we are going to unearth the grim truth of the worst job in medieval Europe. What makes a job truly the worst? Is it the physical danger, the constant threat of death or dismemberment? Is it the sheer, back-breaking labor that grinds down the body and spirit? Is it the social ostracization, the contempt and fear of one's fellow man? Or is it something more visceral, a relentless assault on the senses, a daily immersion in filth and putrefaction that would break even the strongest will? We will explore these criteria, peeling back the layers of history to reveal the forgotten lives of those who performed the tasks no one else would touch. Consider for a moment the peasant. The vast majority of the medieval population toiled in the fields, bound to the land, their lives dictated by the seasons and the demands of their feudal lord. They plowed, sowed, harvested, and threshed, their days long and arduous, their diets meager, their homes often little more than hovels. They faced famine, disease, and the constant threat of violence from passing armies or greedy overlords. Their lives were undoubtedly hard, a relentless cycle of physical exertion and poverty. But was it the worst? Perhaps not in the same category as some of the truly specialized horrors we will uncover. The peasant, for all their suffering, was part of the fabric of society, their labor essential, and in its own way, respected as the foundation of all wealth. They might be poor, but they weren't necessarily despised for their work itself. Then there were the soldiers, the men-at-arms who fought and died for their lords. Their lives were punctuated by moments of intense terror and violence, the risk of a gruesome death or crippling injury ever present. They endured long marches, poor rations, and the brutal realities of medieval warfare. Yet for some, there was also the promise of glory, the camaraderie of their fellows, and the potential for plunder. A soldier's life was dangerous, yes, but it often carried a certain prestige, a martial honor that elevated it above mere drudgery. It was a choice, albeit sometimes a desperate one, that held the possibility of a different kind of life, even if short-lived. What about the executioner? This was a figure universally feared and reviled, living on the fringes of society, often housed outside the town walls. Their job was to inflict pain, to take lives, to be the instrument of justice, or often injustice. The psychological toll must have been immense, the social stigma absolute. Yet the executioner also held a unique, macabre power. They were often well paid, granted certain privileges, and their touch, though dreaded, was also sometimes sought for its perceived magical properties, particularly for healing. Their work was undeniably horrific, but it was not the daily immersion in filth and degradation that characterized other professions. It was a job of profound moral and social burden, but perhaps not the most physically repulsive. Let us now turn our attention to professions that truly embody the nadir of medieval employment. These are the jobs that demanded a complete surrender of comfort, dignity, and often health. They were the essential but utterly disgusting tasks that kept medieval towns from drowning in their own refuse, that transformed raw, putrid materials into useful goods, or that dealt with the grim realities of death and decay. One such contender for the title of worst job is the tanner. Imagine a medieval town, Even the most prosperous cities were far from clean. Open sewers ran through the streets, animals roamed freely, and refuse was often simply tossed out windows. But amidst this general squalor, there were certain areas that were considered particularly noxious, places where the very air was thick with an unbearable stench that clung to everything and everyone nearby. These were the tanneries. Tanning was the process of transforming raw animal hides into leather, a material crucial for everything from shoes and belts to armor and book bindings. Without leather, medieval society would have ground to a halt, but the process itself was horrifying. It was a multi-stage operation, each step more vile than the last, and all of it centered around putrefaction and noxious chemicals. The first step was acquiring the hides. These often came directly from the butcher, still bloody, sometimes still bearing remnants of flesh and fat. If not processed quickly, they would begin to rot, attracting swarms of flies and maggots, and emitting a sickeningly sweet, putrid odor. The tanner's initial task was to clean these hides, scraping off any remaining flesh, fat, and hair. This was done using specialized knives and scrapers, often over a wooden beam, a messy and bloody business that smeared the worker in animal gore. But the real horror began with the dehairing and softening process. To remove the hair and prepare the hide for tanning, it needed to be soaked in a series of highly corrosive and putrid solutions. One common method involved soaking the hides in pits filled with a mixture of lime and water. Lime, a strong alkali, would loosen the hair and begin to break down the epidermis. The tanner would stand in these pits, often barefoot or in rudimentary wooden clogs, stirring the hides with long poles or even by wading through the corrosive sludge. The lime could cause severe chemical burns, blistering the skin and leading to chronic skin conditions. Even worse, and perhaps the most infamous aspect of medieval tanning, was the use of urine and animal dung. Yes, you heard that correctly. Urine, particularly human urine, was highly prized for its ammonia content, which acted as a powerful softening agent. Tanneries would often have contracts with local households or even public toilets to collect vast quantities of urine. Imagine the smell: huge vats filled with stale, fermenting urine, into which animal hides were plunged. The tanner would plunge their hands and arms into this revolting concoction, manipulating the hides, ensuring even saturation. The stench of ammonia, mingled with decaying animal matter, must have been overwhelming, searing the nostrils and clinging to every fiber of clothing, every pore of skin. Animal dung, especially dog dung known as pure, was also used in some stages for its enzymatic properties, which helped to further break down the hide's structure and make it pliable. This meant more pits, more stirring, more direct contact with excrement. The tanner's workshop was a landscape of open pits, brimming with putrid liquids, bubbling with decomposition, and swarming with flies attracted by the stench. The ground was perpetually wet with slime and effluent, the air thick with an invisible cloud of decay. After these initial treatments, the hides were ready for the actual tanning, which involved soaking them in solutions of tannin derived from tree bark, most commonly oak bark. This process could take months, sometimes even years, requiring constant attention, rotation of hides, and replenishment of the tannin solution. The pits for this stage were less immediately offensive than the urine and lime pits, but the sheer volume of decaying organic matter and the constant dampness still contributed to an oppressive, unhealthy environment. The health risks for tanners were profound. Chronic exposure to lime caused severe skin irritation, open sores, and even blindness if splashed in the eyes. The ammonia fumes from the urine pits could damage the respiratory system, leading to chronic coughs, bronchitis, and other lung ailments. The constant dampness and immersion in putrid water led to fungal infections, foot rot, and other skin diseases. Cuts and scrapes, an inevitability in such a manual profession, were highly susceptible to infection from the bacterial-laden environment, often leading to blood poisoning and limb loss. The overall life expectancy of a tanner was undoubtedly lower than average, their bodies ravaged by their trade. Socially, tanners were outcasts. The smell of their work was so pervasive that it was impossible to escape. It clung to their clothes, their hair, their skin, and even, it was said, seeped into their very pores. They were often forced to live and work in designated areas, usually on the outskirts of towns, downwind from the main population centers, often near a river for water supply and waste disposal. People avoided tanners, not just because of the smell, but because they were seen as unclean, almost defiled by their constant contact with death and decay. They were necessary, yes, but necessary evils, tolerated only because their product was indispensable. Marriage outside the tanning community was often difficult, if not impossible, and their children were often destined to follow in their father's footsteps, trapped in a cycle of reviled labor. The daily life of a tanner was one of relentless, back-breaking labor, performed in an environment that assaulted every sense. The constant lifting and moving of heavy, wet hides, the stooping over pits, the scraping, the stirring. It was a physically demanding job that left bodies aching and prematurely aged. And all of it, every single day, performed under the oppressive, inescapable pall of the most horrific stench imaginable. For sheer, unadulterated sensory assault and social degradation, combined with physical hardship and health risks, the tanner makes a very strong case for the worst job in medieval Europe. But wait, there are other contenders. If the tanner dealt with animal carcasses and their byproducts, what about the person whose entire existence revolved around the disposal of human waste? This brings us to perhaps the most universally acknowledged contender for the title, the gong farmer, or sometimes known as apprentice. The gong farmer's job was simple, yet utterly horrifying, to empty cesspits and privies. In an era before modern plumbing, human waste accumulated in deep pits dug beneath latrines or in rudimentary outdoor privies. These cesspits, sometimes lined with stone, sometimes just simple holes in the ground, would fill up over time, becoming putrid reservoirs of human excrement, urine, and whatever else was flushed or tossed down. They were breeding grounds for disease, swarming with rats, flies, and all manner of vermin. And when they became full, they had to be emptied. This was the grim domain of the gong farmer. The very name gong farmer itself is thought to derive from the Old English word gang, meaning to go, referring to their nocturnal rounds, or perhaps from the gong or privy itself. Their work was so foul, so utterly beyond the pale of normal human activity, that it was often legislated to be performed only at night. In many medieval towns, laws stipulated that gong farmers could only work between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m., ensuring that the general populace would not have to witness, or more importantly, smell their activities during daylight hours. This meant working in the dark, often by the flickering light of a lantern, adding another layer of danger and isolation to an already hellish task. Imagine a typical night for a gong farmer. The air, even in the dead of night, might still carry the faint, general stench of a medieval town, but nothing could prepare one for the concentrated, suffocating effluvium that emanated from a full cesspit. Armed with shovels, buckets, and perhaps a ladder, the gong farmer would arrive at the designated privy. The first challenge was often accessing the pit itself. Sometimes there was a trapdoor, sometimes a removable section of flooring. Often it involved descending into a dark, confined space. The cesspit itself was a nightmare. Depending on its depth and age, it could be a semi-liquid sludge, a thick, viscous paste, or even a hardened, compacted mass of centuries of human waste. The smell beyond description would be a suffocating blend of ammonia, methane, hydrogen sulfide, and the indescribable odor of decaying human feces. These gases were not just offensive, they were deadly. Methane, in high concentrations, could cause asphyxiation by displacing oxygen. Hydrogen sulfide, even at low concentrations, could cause respiratory paralysis and death. Many gong farmers undoubtedly succumbed to these invisible killers, collapsing in the pits they were trying to empty. Working in the dark, often knee-deep or even waist-deep in excrement, the gong farmer would shovel the putrid contents into buckets. These buckets, heavy with their vile cargo, then had to be hauled out of the pit, often by hand or using a rudimentary pulley system. The process was slow, arduous, and incredibly messy. Splashes were inevitable, coating the worker in the foulest material imaginable. Their clothes, their skin, their hair, everything would be saturated with the stench and substance of human waste. Once the buckets were full and brought to the surface, they had to be transported. Gong farmers typically used large wooden carts, often open-topped, to haul the collected night soil out of the town. These carts, leaking and dripping their putrid contents, would rumble through the deserted streets, leaving a trail of unimaginable stench in their wake. The destination was usually a designated dumping ground outside the city walls, or sometimes, ironically, to fields where the night soil would be spread as fertilizer, a practice that, while economically sensible, also contributed to the spread of disease. The dangers of the job extended beyond the noxious gases. Falling into a deep cesspit could mean drowning in excrement or becoming trapped and succumbing to the fumes. The risk of disease was astronomical. Gong farmers were constantly exposed to pathogens like cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and countless other bacterial and parasitic infections. Their hands, constantly in contact with raw sewage, were vectors for illness, and despite any rudimentary attempts at washing, the sheer volume of contamination made cleanliness impossible. Cuts and abrasions, common in such physical labor, would quickly become infected, leading to sepsis and death. Socially, the gong farmer was at the absolute bottom rung of society, even below the tanner. The tanner, at least, produced a valuable product from animal parts. The gong farmer dealt with the most despised, most disgusting byproduct of human existence. They were untouchable, literally and figuratively. People recoiled from them, not just because of the smell, which was undoubtedly profound and persistent, but because their very profession was seen as defiling. They were a living embodiment of the filth that society sought to hide and ignore. They were the necessary evil, the unsung heroes of medieval sanitation, yet they received no respect, only revulsion. Their pay, while sometimes better than a common laborer due to the unpleasantness and danger of the work, was still often barely enough to live on. What good was money if it condemned you to a life of such profound misery and social isolation? They lived in the shadows, worked in the shadows, and died, often young, from the diseases and dangers of their trade, leaving behind a legacy of stink and sickness. The gong farmer's existence was a testament to the sheer desperation that drove some to accept such a fate, a life of unrelenting squalor and degradation. The sheer volume of waste in a medieval town meant that the gong farmer's work was never-ending. Every household, every inn, every public building generated its daily quota of human excrement. The pits would fill, and the call would go out for the gong farmer. It was a cyclical, Sisyphean task, a constant battle against the tide of human filth, a battle that could never truly be won, only temporarily managed. The psychological toll of such a life, immersed in the most primal and disgusting aspects of human existence, is almost impossible to comprehend. To spend every working night surrounded by the stench of decay, the sight of human waste, and the knowledge that this was your lot in life, must have been soul-crushing. Consider the tools of their trade: simple shovels, often made of wood or iron, sometimes with a long handle to reach deeper into the pits. Buckets, usually wooden, reinforced with iron bands, designed to hold the heavy, sloshing contents. Ladders, often rickety and unstable, used to descend into the depths. All of these tools would be perpetually caked in dried and semi-liquid excrement, adding to the pervasive stench of the gong farmer's person and possessions. There was no concept of disinfection, no understanding of germ theory. The tools were simply scraped clean as best as possible, perhaps rinsed with water and then used again the next night. The legal framework surrounding gong farmers further illustrates their peculiar position in society. In London, for example, regulations from the 14th century stipulated not only the hours of their work, but also that they were responsible for carrying the waste out of the city and disposing of it in designated locations. Fines could be levied if they were caught working during the day or if they dumped their cargo illegally. This was a clear attempt by authorities to control the nuisance and public health risk posed by the trade, while simultaneously relying entirely on it. These were not jobs people chose out of ambition or desire. They were jobs of last resort, often passed down through generations within families who had little other option. The sheer scale of the problem these individuals tackled is also worth noting. A single medieval household, even a small one, could generate a significant amount of waste daily. Multiply that by thousands of households in a bustling city like London or Paris, and the volume becomes staggering. Without the gong farmers, these cities would have become utterly uninhabitable, choked by their own effluvia. They were the unsung, unseen, and unthanked heroes of medieval public health, albeit operating under conditions that would today be considered a gross violation of human rights. The knacker or the fellmonger in some contexts also presents a compelling case for the worst job. While the tanner worked with fresh hides and the gong farmer with human waste, the knacker dealt with the carcasses of dead animals, horses, cows, sheep, and other livestock that had died of disease, old age, or accident. This was not the work of a butcher, who dealt with healthy animals slaughtered for food. The knacker's domain was death and decay. Like the tanner and the gong farmer, the knacker's yard was almost always located on the very outskirts of town, downwind, far from residential areas. The reason was obvious: the smell. The knacker's primary task was to collect animal carcasses, often bloated, fly-blown, and already in an advanced state of decomposition. Imagine the sight and smell of a cart piled high with decaying animal bodies, rumbling slowly through the unpaved lanes. Upon arrival at the knacker's yard, the grim work began. The first step was often flaying the animal, removing its hide. This was done to salvage the leather, which could then be sold to tanners. However, unlike the relatively fresh hides a butcher might provide, a knacker's hide would often be putrid, covered in maggots, and difficult to work with. The process of skinning a decaying animal was messy, bloody, and nauseating, performed with specialized knives that often became dull quickly from contact with bone and gristle. The worker would be covered in fluids, blood, and decaying flesh. After the hide was removed, the rest of the carcass had to be disposed of or processed. In many cases, the meat was considered unfit for human consumption due to disease or advanced decay, but it could sometimes be boiled down to extract fat or tallow for candles and soap. The bones could be ground into bone meal for fertilizer or used to make various tools and implements. The hair could be used for stuffing or other purposes. This meant boiling large vats of animal remains, a process that would release an even more intense and sickening odor into the air, a thick, greasy, putrid smell of boiled death that would cling to the knacker's premises and person. The health risks for the knacker were immense. Dealing with diseased animal carcasses meant constant exposure to zoonotic diseases, illnesses that can be transmitted from animals to humans. Anthrax, tuberculosis, brucellosis, and various parasitic infections were all ever-present threats. Cuts and scrapes, again an inevitability, could easily become infected with deadly bacteria from the decaying flesh. The constant handling of heavy, unwieldy carcasses led to physical strain, injuries, and chronic pain. The air in a knacker's yard would be thick with putrefaction, attracting flies in swarms, and the ground would be permanently stained with blood and animal fluids. Socially, the knacker was viewed with the same revulsion as the tanner and the gong farmer. Their work was undeniably essential. Without them, Dead animals would simply rot in the streets and fields, spreading disease and fouling the environment even further. But their proximity to death, their constant contact with decay, and the inescapable stench that clung to them made them pariahs. They were seen as unclean, perhaps even unholy, by association with death. Like the tanner, they were often isolated, living in their own small communities on the fringes, rarely interacting with the wider population except for business. The knacker's life was one of grim practicality, a daily confrontation with the end of life and the process of decomposition. It was a physically demanding, dangerous, and utterly disgusting profession, performed by those for whom other options simply did not exist. Their existence highlighted the harsh realities of medieval life, where every part of an animal was utilized, no matter how unpleasant the process, and where certain individuals were condemned to perform the tasks that kept society functioning at its most basic level, at immense personal cost. The question of which of these jobs was truly the worst is a difficult one, as each presented its own unique horrors. The tanner, with the corrosive chemicals and the pervasive, sickening smell of urine and decaying hides. The knacker, with the constant exposure to diseased carcasses and the putrid stench of boiled death. And the gong farmer, plunged into the literal depths of human excrement, battling deadly gases and unimaginable filth in the dead of night. Perhaps the gong farmer edges out the others due to the sheer, visceral horror of direct, constant immersion in human waste, combined with the extreme danger of toxic gases and the absolute social ostracism. There is a primal revulsion to human excrement that perhaps surpasses even that of decaying animal matter. The gong farmer's work was a direct assault on every sense, a constant reminder of the most ignoble aspects of human existence. Let's delve deeper into the daily routine and challenges faced by a gong farmer to truly appreciate the depths of their suffering. Imagine a gong farmer named Thomas living in 14th century London. His day, or rather his night, would begin not with the rising sun but with its setting. As the city lights began to dim and most honest folk retreated indoors, Thomas would prepare for his shift. His clothes would already be stained and stiff with the dried residue of previous nights, a testament to the futility of trying to truly clean them. The smell, a permanent fixture, would be an invisible shroud around him. He might share a small, cramped dwelling on the outskirts of the city, perhaps with other gong farmers or laborers in equally despised trades. His family, if he had one, would be accustomed to his nocturnal absences and the inescapable odor he carried. Dinner would be a simple, meager affair, perhaps a bowl of pottage or some stale bread, eaten quickly before the onset of his grim duties. As darkness fell, Thomas would gather his tools. A sturdy wooden shovel, its blade worn smooth from countless nights of scraping. A few heavy wooden buckets, their seams swollen from constant saturation. And a small, sputtering lantern, its dim light barely piercing the oppressive gloom. He would hitch his cart, a crude, open-topped wooden affair, to a tired, old horse, an animal perhaps as weary and resigned as Thomas himself. The cart itself would be a repository of smells, its wood deeply impregnated with the stench of human waste, its wheels caked with the dried residue of past journeys. His first destination might be a wealthy merchant's house in the heart of the city. These houses, often multi-storied, would have privies built into the structure, with cesspits extending deep into the ground beneath. Thomas would navigate the narrow, winding streets, the clip-clop of his horse's hooves and the creak of his cart echoing eerily in the quiet night. The few people he might encounter would give him a wide berth, perhaps covering their noses with a cloth, their expressions a mixture of disgust and fear. Upon arrival, he would have to locate the access point to the cesspit. This might be a stone slab in a courtyard, a wooden trapdoor in a cellar, or even an opening within the privy structure itself. The moment the cover was lifted, the full, unadulterated horror of the pit would assault him. The stench, concentrated and suffocating, would burst forth, a physical blow to the senses. The dim light of his lantern would reveal a churning, seething mass of human excrement, often teeming with maggots, rats, and other vermin that made their homes in this putrid ecosystem. Thomas would have to descend. Sometimes the pits were shallow enough to work from the edge, but often they were many feet deep, requiring a descent into the claustrophobic, gas-filled abyss. He would climb down a rickety ladder, the rough wood digging into his hands, the air growing thicker and more noxious with every step. The sensation of his feet sinking into the cold, viscous sludge at the bottom of the pit would be a nightly horror. The darkness would be absolute, save for the weak glow of his lantern, which would cast dancing shadows on the putrid walls of the pit. The work would begin. Shovel after shovel, he would scoop the heavy, clinging mass into his buckets. The sound would be a sickening slosh and plop, punctuated by the occasional scuttling of rats dislodged from their nests. Each bucket, weighing perhaps 50 pounds or more, would have to be lifted carefully to avoid spilling, and then passed up to an assistant, if he had one, or hauled up by a rope and pulley system he operated himself. The strain on his back, arms, and shoulders would be immense, a constant, grinding physical exertion. As he worked, the gases would build up around him. He might feel lightheaded, nauseous, his eyes stinging, his throat burning. He would know instinctively the danger, perhaps having seen fellow Gong farmers collapse in these very pits. The threat of asphyxiation, of being overcome by the fumes and drowning in the filth, was a constant companion. A misstep, a moment of dizziness, could mean a gruesome end. Hours would pass in this hellish routine. The buckets would be filled, hauled, and emptied into his cart. The cart would slowly fill, its contents sloshing and smelling, a moving monument to human waste. He would likely move from one cesspit to another, perhaps several in a single night, depending on their size and how full they were. The concept of clean was utterly meaningless to Thomas. He was perpetually covered in filth, the smell of which would penetrate his very being, clinging to his skin, his hair, his breath. As dawn approached, casting a pale gray light over the city, Thomas would begin his journey out of the city walls. The streets, now beginning to stir with the first few early risers, would again see him fill steadily, sloshing with its vile cargo, each load adding to the overwhelming stench that already clung to Thomas like a curse. Once the pit was emptied to a workable level, never truly clean, just manageable for more use, he would replace the cover and make his way back through the silent streets, his cart groaning under the weight of human waste. The journey out of the city was its own ordeal. Though the laws dictated that Gong farmers worked at night, there were always late-night stragglers, drunks, or watchmen who would catch sight, and more importantly, smell of Thomas and his load. They recoiled, sometimes hurling insults, sometimes throwing stones or refuse in disgust. He bore it silently. Words were useless against such deep-rooted revulsion. At the edge of the city walls lay the designated dumping grounds, foul pits dug into the earth, already overflowing with the discarded waste of thousands. Here, Thomas would shovel the buckets empty, sometimes tipping the entire cart to release its contents in one thick, nauseating cascade. The stench here was indescribable, a choking mixture of old and fresh excrement, rotting vegetable matter, and the ever-present swarms of flies that rose in black clouds at the slightest disturbance. Only after this grim duty was complete could he make his weary way home. By then, dawn often broke across the city, its light revealing his stained clothes, his blistered hands, and the filth caked beneath his nails. The smell never left him. No matter how he scrubbed, the ammonia, the rot, and the sour tang of human waste clung to his body. He was marked permanently by his work. And yet, without Thomas and men like him, medieval cities would have collapsed under the weight of their own filth. Disease would have spread even more rapidly, streets would have become impassable, and daily life impossible. They were the invisible, unthanked backbone of sanitation, hated but indispensable. When comparing the tanner, the knacker, and the Gong farmer, the answer to the worst job in medieval Europe becomes clearer. The tanner endured corrosive chemicals, unending stench, and social stigma. The knacker faced diseased carcasses and the horrors of decay. But the gong farmer, immersed nightly in humanity's most reviled byproduct, battling deadly gases, suffocating fumes, and total social ostracism, may indeed stand alone at the very bottom of medieval society. Theirs was a life defined not just by filth, but by invisibility, laboring in the shadows, seen only as a necessary evil. And perhaps that, more than the stench or the danger, was the greatest cruelty of all.